I want to look at one more story before we head to lunch. It's a very cool story. I know I say that a lot, so sorry. I like all these stories. But it's a story of the finding of the bride. The pattern is the bridal pattern. There is a bridal theme in the Bible. The Bible begins with a wedding. The Bible ends in a wedding. You hear that? It begins and ends the same. Do you know what that is? That's poetry. Poetry. Begins and ends the same. And in between, you find all of these stories about brides. And then you get to the New Testament, and who's the bride? Yeah, we are. All right. So let's look at a story. There are four main characters to this story. It's found in Genesis chapter 24. You're going to know the different characters, or at least three of the four characters you'll probably know. But I don't want you to focus on the names of the characters. I don't want you to think for a few minutes about all the things that you know about the characters, though there will be many things, and that'll be helpful later. I want you to focus on the role that each character plays in the story. So, for example, Abraham is one of the characters in the story. That's great. We know all about Abraham. But Abraham in the story is a father. There is a father in the story. And the father has a son. In fact, he's a one and only son. We've heard all about him the last 2 days. His name is Isaac. But the father has a son. The father also has a servant. He's not just a father, he's a master. His servant's name is Eliezer. He's the lesser well-known person in the story. And the fourth character is Rebecca, and she's the bride. Keep your eye on the bride. Don't miss the bride, and don't miss the servant. It's those two characters that I want you to think about the most. And the first thing that I want you to see about these characters is they're both asked exactly the same question in this story. And the question is, will you go? And Eliezer the servant is the first to be asked this question. Now, this is going to be a Presbyterian statement, so just hang with me for a minute. I just point that out because I love that. Abraham is an old man at this point. His wife has died. He's sensing the end of his life, and he has one thing left that he needs to do. It is the duty of the father. It is the privilege of the father to choose the bride for his son. That's the Presbyterian part. It's an Eastern wedding. The father chooses in this case. And so, but he's an old man, and he's not able to do this physically. And so he calls his servant Eliezer in, and he says, okay, Eliezer, here's the deal. I need you to do this for me. I need for you to go out, and I need for you to choose a bride for my son. And Eliezer says, Abraham, master, that's not a problem, because there are all kinds of women here in the town, and I'll line up about 3 o'clock this afternoon. I'll have 20 great candidates. And Abraham says, no, you don't understand. You can't pick a bride for my son from this group of people. These are Canaanite people. The women keep their gods when they come into the marriage. It's not going to work. He says, you need to go back to my land, to the place that I come from, to the Semitic peoples, and you need to choose from amongst my people a bride for my son. Eliezer, will you go? Now, this is a really big request. He's not asking him to greet people at the door of church only. He's not asking him to help him park cars. He's not asking him to lead a children's ministry. He's not asking him to preach a sermon. He's not asking him to do any of these things, all of which are very important. But the point is, he's not coming to him and saying, well, you carve out a little bit of your time in life and then devote that little bit of your time in life to this mission of finding the bride. He's asking him for everything. One of the commentators I read said it would have taken 1.5 years just to get there. So it's 3 years round trip, assuming that he finds the bride quick. It's a big deal. He would have been traveling by camel. There would have been risk involved. Who knows what territories he would have gone through. More than that, he's going to be entrusted with a great deal of wealth and gifts to be used for what? So that he can play golf all along the way? Is that it? So he can eat at really nice restaurants every single night? He has to pay a dowry price for the bride. He compensates the bride's family. He needs every single day when he wakes up in the morning to ask, how do I use these gifts that the Father has given me? How do I use what wealth the Father has given me? How do I use these resources the Father has given me to honor the mission the Father has given me today? That's the faithful servant. And then there's a major risk attached to this, and that is he can get all the way there, and he can meet the bride, find a right girl, and she can say no. Because what is he going to ask her to do? This is very important. He's going to be asking her to marry a man that she's never met and to live out her days with him in a land that she's never seen after taking a long journey to get there. Eliezer, will you go? And he says, yes, I will go. So then we pick up the story, Genesis 24, verse 10. It says, then the servant Eliezer took 10 camels from the camels of his master and set out with a variety of good things of his master's in his hand. There's a real ownership issue being established here. And he arose and he went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. So he travels 1.5 years, and that's all the press he gets in the Bible. He has this major journey, and that's it. That's all it says. He went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. So he arrives in the land of his master. He's amongst the right people. And so he checks into a 5-star hotel, and he books himself for a massage, and he gets a pedicure and a manicure, and he has a great dinner because it's been 1.5 years on the road, and it's already taken him 1.5 years. Surely it can wait another day. It cannot wait another day. It's not what he does. There is an urgency to this mission. We need to learn from this servant. This guy is on a mission, and he is ruthless about it. It says he gets there, and he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at evening time. Why? Because that's the time when women go out to draw water in that culture. They would go out in the cool of the day. They'd go in the mornings, they'd go in the evenings. And they would go together, by the way. It was a big social event. And there's safety in numbers, too. That's why when you get to the woman at the well, she comes out in the middle of the day and she comes out alone. She's ashamed, and she's been rejected by the other women. Okay? So he makes the camels kneel down. He has a strategy. That's good. And he does that. He makes them kneel down by the well of water at evening time, the time when women go out to draw water, and he prays because he knows that if God is not in it, it's just never going to happen. And he says, "O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show loving kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men are coming out to draw water, and I know the right girl is here somewhere. The bride is here, but I have no idea who she is." And so he establishes a very severe test. He says in prayer to the Lord, "Now may it be that the girl to whom I say, 'Please let down your jar so that I may have a drink,' and who answers, 'Drink,' and then here's the test, 'and I will water your camels also.'" She's going to volunteer to do this on her own. He's not going to ask her to do it. "May she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness to my master." Now, why is that the test? Because a thirsty camel drinks about 25 gallons of water, and he has 10 camels. So this girl, and she would have been, 13, 14 years old, is going to pull 250 gallons of water out of a deep, dark well, and she's going to volunteer to do it like he's not even going to bring up the topic. That's the test. And then this is great. It's one of the best phrases in the whole story.
Hallelujah.
It says, "Before he had finished speaking." The Lord is answering his prayer before he's even got it all the way out of his mouth. I mean, this is the kind of prayer that God is just looking to answer. Before he had finished speaking, and then the word is behold. It's a word of sight. The word means look. And he wants you to see this girl. It's important for you to see her, to take her in, to hear his description. "Look," he says, "Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor," so she has the right pedigree, came out with her jar on her shoulder, and then it says this, here's the description. The girl was not just beautiful, she was very beautiful. And she was a virgin, and not only, and like if you miss that, he says a virgin, and no man had had relations with her. It states her purity twice. And she went down to the spring and filled up her jar and came up, and the servant very calmly and nonchalantly, no. The servant ran. There's an urgency. He ran to meet her and he said, please, let me drink a little water from your jar. That's all he says. And she says, drink, my lord. And she quickly lowered her jar to her hand and gave him a drink. And he's thinking, okay, so far so good, but what about the camels? And when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will also draw for your camels until they have finished drinking. So I'm not going to give them a sip. I'm going to satisfy them completely. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all 10 of his camels. And meanwhile, the man was gazing at her in silence to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. And, you want to go, come on, man, what are you worried about? She just pulled up 250 gallons of water. Of course no, it's not successful yet. He's found the right girl, but she still has to agree to marry a man that she's never met and to live out her days with him in a land she's never seen after traveling a really long way to get there. So anyway, if you know the deal, after the camels are done drinking, he gives her a gold ring and he lavishes these gifts upon her that he's conserved for this occasion. And he says, can I stay at your father's household? And she says, absolutely, you can stay. She's loving all the gifts. So she runs home. She tells her brother, who's the head of the household at that point, hey, this is what happened. And he makes this feast ready. And so here comes this guy who hasn't had a kind of banquet like this in a year and a half. And he won't eat. Why will he not eat? He won't eat because his mission is more important than any of his appetites, even one as fundamental as food. Think about that. Hallelujah. This is an amazing man. Amazing. It says in verse 33, but when food was set before him to eat, he said, I will not eat until I have told my business. I'm on a mission. And Laban the brother said, speak on. And so then with great detail, he begins to recount the whole story. It's the heart of the father that his son have a bride. And the father sent me to this people to find a bride. And I came to find a bride from this particular family. And I prayed this prayer, real specific about the camels and 250 gallons and the whole deal. And out came, your sister. And here she came. And I did this and she did that. And she gave water to it's so clear when he gets to the end of the story that what he is asking is whether she will go. And everybody understands that. Will she agree to marry a man that she's never met and live out her days with him in a land that she's never seen? And in verse 58, we get her answer. It says, then they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. And then Rebekah and the servant, the bride and the servant, set out on this incredibly long journey. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to hear their conversation. Wouldn't, if you were this woman, want to know some things about this guy that you've agreed to marry, haven't met? What would she have learned? What do we know about Isaac? We've talked about it. Born of a supernatural birth. She would have learned that the son of the father had a supernatural birth. She would have learned that the son of the father was the son of promise. That it's through him, ultimately, way down the road genealogically, that salvation will come. And she would have heard the story that we talked about yesterday. She would have heard how when the father was 116 and when the son was 16, that God came to the father and said, I want you to take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, to the region of Moriah. I want you to walk him up a mountain there and sacrifice him to me. She would have heard how the son carried the wood of sacrifice up the hill and willingly laid his life down upon it. And how God released him from that. She would have heard all of those stories. And so it says that when she finally arrives, verse 64, Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel. So it seems as though, even though she does not know him, hasn't seen him, there's something familiar. It's like she recognizes him. And she says to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" It's like she wants to verify that her instinct is right. And the servant said, He's my master. He's the one. And then she took her veil and covered herself. She's committed to the process. The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. He's accountable for his mission of finding the bride, you see. There's an accounting in the end for him. And then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. And he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. And that's a great story about a father, a son, and a servant and a bride. But what about us? Who are we in the story? Both. Yeah, I mean, first of all, we're the bride, right? It's the heart of the Father is to provide a bride for his Son. And without any time that we had even known it, I mean, long before we were even born into this world, Father God planned a wedding just for us. It's a beautiful thought. It's also kind of cool to think to yourself, who better knows the passions of the heart of his Son than the Father? And for some reason, he's chosen us. It's glorious. It's amazing. And we had no idea that it was coming until God sent his servant to us. And that servant might have been a mother, a father, a teacher, a pastor, a friend, or an EE worker. Any one of the above. And that servant invested his time and his talents and his money into bringing you the proposal of marriage. And what is the proposal that he brought you? It is for you to agree to be joined by faith eternally to a man you've never met, and to live out your days eternally with him in a land you've never seen. And where are you right now? You're on the camel. You're on the journey. And what are the stories you've heard? What's Christmas? Supernatural birth. He's the true son of promise. He's the true Isaac. And what did he do? By the will of his Father and faith in the resurrection of the third day, took the wood of sacrifice and willingly laid his life down. And no one stayed his Father's hand. Why? Because you and I are not like Rebekah. We are not beautiful, we are not virginal, and we are not pure. We're not. But through the love of the greater Isaac, we are made what we are not naturally. He makes us beautiful. He makes us pure. And so you're the bride, okay? But you're also the servant. We've got to get up every day and say, okay, Lord, you've given me all of this, whatever this is, gifts, whatever, for this mission. How do I, this day, use these in such a way as to honor the purpose and the mission for which you have given them to me? And when you arrive in his country, there's an accounting, isn't there? And you know what's kind of cool? Is at the beginning of the story when Abraham met with his servant, and his servant no doubt said something like, but what if she doesn't agree to come? Say I do it all right and it doesn't happen. Abraham said, if she doesn't agree to come and you have faithfully executed the mission, I will relieve you from the duty and you will be a good and faithful servant to me. Our job is to be faithful. Our job is to do the best we can with all that God gives us and by the power of God. And let him worry about the success. I don't think that the pastors with the big churches are going to have a bigger mansion in heaven. I'm quite sure that there are going to be some very people that you've never heard of who have the nicest places. Our job is to be faithful. So, you're Rebekah, and you're moving toward the vision of the one to whom you are betrothed. And you're the servant. who has been entrusted with much for finding the bride. And the question, and you guys have all answered this already, but it's will you go? Right? But this book, as we said yesterday, it's very simple. A child can read it, but you cannot plumb its depths. It's very, 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 very deep. And the deeper you mine, it's like mining. In fact, that's one of the images that's used in the poetry of the Bible. It's mining. What is mining? You're digging down into the earth and sifting and digging and sifting and digging and sifting and digging and sifting. And those who dig and sift and persevere find the gems. That's who finds the gold. There's a lot of gold in the Bible. It's all over the place. It's a rich mine. Going with Goliath of Gath. That's where Goliath is from. It's Goliath of Gath. And David takes that head and buries it in Jerusalem. Is that the place where Jesus was crucified? Good question. But that's an interesting observation that you're thinking along. That's good. It's good.
To finish off with said, David said that what I think coming is from shield, full armor. Jesus came to this earth without being supposed to.
That's right.
He conquered the works of the devil through the power of God. So
he fights with different weapons.
Yes. The Bible says our weapons are not visual. Our weapons are pulling down.
Right. All right, you guys are awesome. The story of David and Goliath, you just read it. It happens when King Saul is in charge. We talked about that, right? But David has been anointed to be the next king. Yet he's a boy. However, the narrator of the story repeats over and over again, he's not just a boy, he is a shepherd boy. The father of the son, or the son of the father who is sent to the battlefront comes as a shepherd. Okay? And he's a boy. He's unsuspecting. And he's sent by his dad to go check on the welfare of his brothers, and he comes bringing gifts. Bread among other things. So he comes bringing gifts, and he shows up after 40 days of Goliath treading across the Valley of Elah. The Valley of Elah is a wide, flat valley with hills on either side. And the idea is that on one side of this wide, flat valley, maybe a mile wide, you have the Philistines. On the other side, you have the Israelites. And here comes Goliath every day, and you can see this big guy trucking across the valley. Huge, ginormous. And he defies the armies of the living God, and in doing so, he defies God. To defy his people is to defy him. What does Jesus say to Paul? He says, Paul, why do you persecute who? Me. Not why do you persecute my people? That's a kind of connection that he has with us. To persecute us is to persecute him. So he's defying God himself. And for 40 days he does this, and no one is willing to take up this guy. What he's proposing is what's called a proxy war. He's coming over and he's saying, look, here's the deal. There's no reason for all of our armies to fight all of your armies. Let's do this instead. I, big Goliath of Gath, 9'5", or however tall he was, I will represent all of my people, the Philistines. Sorry to put you in there as the Philistines, Bill. Okay? And you pick somebody who will be your champion. And he will represent all of the people of Israel. And the two of us will fight it out. And whoever wins, wins for the whole nation. It's a representative battle. That's very important. Okay? Now, that's a great idea, unless you're like in the army of Israel and you're looking at 9'5" Goliath and you're thinking, man, who wants to fight that? So David shows up day 41 of this process. After 40 days of, I guess, famine in some sense. Certainly there's been a famine of courage. And so he shows up, and just in time to hear the rant. Okay? 1 Samuel 17, verse 4, then a champion came out from the army of the Philistines. He's a champion. He represents his nation, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So that's about 9 feet, 5 inches tall. He is huge. Or you can look at it differently and say he is long. His length is what's talked about. That's important. It says he had a bronze helmet on his head. So now he's going to talk about the head of this man, right? And he was clothed with what kind of an armor? A scale armor. What is he describing here? He's describing a long, scaly snake. Snake. Whose head is going to be crushed. Right, Bill? Following? So he's clothed with scales, is the idea, which weigh 5,000 shekels of bronze. Okay, great. He's a long, scaly, deadly snake. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield carrier also walked before him, and not surprisingly, none of the Israelites wanted to fight this guy. But here comes David. He hears the daily rant. And he recognized, as all of the Israelites fled and left him standing there, that A, the people of God need rescuing, B, nothing short of the glory of God is at stake in this mission, and C, he's the only one still standing on the hill, because everyone else has run. So David starts talking to the Israelite soldiers, and he really cuts down this guy. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine, okay? That he should taunt the armies of the living God. He's saying, look, if Israel needs a champion, I'm your guy. I'll be that guy. And the word starts spreading through the camp like a wildfire. You can imagine that it would. That David, the shepherd boy, please, has volunteered to take on Goliath. And to show you how fearful they all are. Eventually, they take him up on it. Saul calls him into his tent. It says, Saul said to David, you are not able to go up against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. You're a pup, you're a babe, you're a child, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. He is a shepherd. The point is made repeatedly in the story. And when a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and attacked him, and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck and killed him. He's not just a shepherd. He's a shepherd that leaves the 99 to go find the one when it's taken by a lion or a bear. He's a really good shepherd. Really good. Your servant, David says, has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So David is the shepherd, the son of the father. He comes bearing gifts. He suffers the derision of his brothers. You remember, he says, hey, I think I can do this. And all his brothers are going, oh, you're a show-off, and you're a showboater, and you're a... What is he going to do? He's going to step forward to represent his entire people. And he's going to fight and serve. Okay? Wholly dependent upon God for his deliverance. And Saul, who was either convinced or desperate, says to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. And David goes out to fight Goliath, not as a warrior. He fights as a shepherd. Okay? Battlements, the armor of Saul doesn't fit. It doesn't suit him. It's not him. The champion is a shepherd. Verse 40. David took his stick in his hand. It's a shepherd's stick, his staff, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. I've stood in that brook. I've taken stones. Thankfully, there are a gazillion more, so if you ever go, there's plenty. There's 5 for you. But the way that it works is there's this hill, and then you come down off the hill, and there's what's called a wadey. A wadey is a river that runs with water during the rainy season, but it's dry otherwise. Maybe a little water. And you have to actually pass through the brook to come up into this flat area called the Elah Valley, where this battle takes place. And the reason that I say that is it's one of those places where you stand and you read the biblical description and you go, my goodness, that is exactly the way the Bible sets this thing up. It's so cool. So he gathers his stones in this brook that he literally has to walk through to get to the battlefield. And he put them in his shepherd's bag. His shepherd's bag. Shepherd all over. Which he had even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand. And he approached the Philistine. And then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. He's the serpent who breaks a curse. The Philistine also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. And then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. You come against me with the weapons of this world. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day, this is confidence, the Lord will deliver you up into my hands. And I will strike you down and remove your what? Your head. Your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the armies of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. He wants the whole world to know that his God is the living God. Amazing. That all the world may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or spear. God fights with a different weapon.
Amen.
And it's more powerful. For the battle is the Lord's, He will give you into our hands. And then it says, and then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran, I love it, quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone, and he swung it and struck the Philistine where? On his arm? No. On his forehead. And the stone crushed his forehead. It sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face. The shepherd, who represents all of his people, who does not fight with the weapons of this world, has crushed the head of the serpentine man. And thus David prevails over this serpentine Philistine with a sling and a stone, with the weapons of a shepherd. And he struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in David's hand with which to kill him. So David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword, the very thing that the Philistine had sought to kill David with. David now turns around and kills him with. That's important. Drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head. How many times did he say head in the story? Over and over. And shepherd, over and over. Words matter. The repetition of words are clues to what the story is all about, to what all these stories are about. And it says, when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And now what do the Israelites do? They've been so scared, inspired by the courage of their champion and his great victory over the serpent on their behalf. They charge the enemy. And they cut them down to the field. Chase them all the way home. They engage in the battle. And Jesus is all over the story, it seems to me. Jesus is the self-proclaimed good shepherd sent by his Father to look after the welfare of his Father's children. He comes bearing gifts. He suffers the derision of his brethren. And out of his love for God and the people of God, he goes forward as our champion to take on the serpent. Does he not? And just as David took that sword of Goliath, that very thing that Goliath had sought to use to kill David with, and he kills him with it, Jesus takes the cross, the very thing that looks like his defeat, and he uses it to defeat and to crush the head of the evil one. It's awesome. He gains victory over it. It's utterly ironic. He turns it all around. Does that make sense? So what are we supposed to do? Well, we're to trust in our champion. For starters, right? And in his victory on our behalf. But I think secondly, we're to do what those Israelites did. We're to be inspired by the great victory of our great champion. To rush down the hill onto the battlefield. To make much of him for his gospel. And I think that we are to fight, in fact I don't think, we're to fight not with the weapons of this world, but with the weapons of our shepherd champion. And what's the weapon that he gives us? It's easy, right? It's what you guys are doing. His word. Yeah, he comes fighting with the word. You see that. I have that in the notes, but you see that in the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, Jesus is going to be arrested. The soldiers are there. And what is it? Peter takes the sword, does he not? He hacks off the ear of the high priest's servant. What does Jesus say? Good job. Way to go. No, he says, put that thing away. What are you doing? He heals the man's ear, and he gives himself over. He fights with different weapons. He stands later before Pontius Pilate. And he says this, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting. So that I would not be handed over to the Jews, but as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. The kingdom of God is advanced by the Spirit of God through the gospel of God, in accordance with the Word of God and at great personal cost to God's people. It is. As a side comment, I would say that, at least in America, we evangelicals have fought in the battle with the world's weapons and have lost. And we need to get back to the message of the gospel. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to win elections and do all kinds of things. And we need to get back to the gospel. What we need in our country, my country, is revival. It's revival. You want to reclaim America, do it that way. As we come back to our study, I want to look at a couple of examples of life, death, burial, resurrection, but not in the Old Testament, but in the book of Acts. And so kind of the question then that we're looking at is, all right, we've seen this pattern in the Old Testament. We've looked at it in all these different stories out of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is saying, look at Jesus, look at Jesus, look at Jesus, look at Jesus in so many different ways. But Jesus now has lived, Jesus now has died, Jesus now has risen again from the dead. Is that the end of the pattern? Or do we also see it showing up in the lives of people after the resurrection? Where the pattern of the life of Christ is being reproduced in the lives, for example, of his disciples, of his apostles. And I don't know, maybe in me. And maybe in you. Maybe that's something we'll see someday. You know, hey, in the midst of that crisis, right there in the midst of it, there was a pattern of life and death and burial and resurrection. As we find that it comes, at least in the lives of Peter and Paul, in the midst of a very trying time. So I want to look at a story involving Peter. It's in Acts chapter 12. And again, Jesus is in heaven. It's a story that opens with a man named Herod. You guys, I'm sure, know that there are many Herods in the New Testament. They're descendants of the original Herod, Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the Herod that was king of the Jews, when Jesus was born. He's the one who killed all the babies in Bethlehem. You'll recall that story. Herod the Great, I will tell you frankly, from the perspective of this world, was truly great, at least in terms of what he accomplished. When you go to the Holy Land today and you look at the fortress of, for example, Masada, and the way that he rebuilt and constructed, it's stunning, it's amazing. There is monument after monument after monument after monument that still stand today that this man built. He was a horribly wicked man. He was a terribly brutal man. But you can understand why, at least in some sense, they termed him the Great. But he had sons and grandsons and so forth. And so you see these other Herods appear. In this story, we're talking about Herod Agrippa I. He was the ruler over Judea and Samaria. When Herod the Great died, his territory was divided up, you see. So this one is the ruler over Judea and Samaria. He's the Jew who rules over the Jews, but he rules over the Jews for the benefit of the Romans, and the Jews don't like him. And that creates political problems for him that his predecessor, Herod the Great, had as well. Herod the Great rebuilt the temple. Well, he did that for the Jews. They're constantly, these rulers are seeking to appease the people or to gain the favor of the people to make their lives as rulers a little bit easier. Well, Herod Agrippa realized that he could make the Jews happy if he could gather up some of the Christian leaders and just start killing them. So he kills James. And you got to feel that, because that's what you want to do as a communicator. That's what you want to do if you want to understand this passage. You got to, again, get in the sandals of these first century Christians, this band of brothers, man. These guys that are the start of this movement of the way, Christianity. And one of their pillars is executed. My goodness. What does that do to the morale of this people? And see, Herod Agrippa sees that and realizes, hey, that makes these guys happy. And then he grabs Peter. Peter is the preeminent apostle, is he not? I mean, he is headline news. And his plan is to kill him. And so these guys are in the midst of a great crisis. And the words of Jesus are echoing in their ears when it says in John 16, verse 33, he says, in this world you will have trouble, but that's not the end of the verse. He then says, but take heart, I have overcome the world. How did he do that? Through his life, through his death, through his burial, and through his resurrection. Yeah, through his resurrection. So let's look for that then. Beginning in verse 3 in Acts 12, it says, when Herod saw that his killing of James, that's what that's referring to, pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. Now, wait a minute. It's during the Passover that Peter is arrested. Follow that? That's important. And when Herod had seized him, he put him into a prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people, which is just a way of saying to take him out and cut his head off before the people. His plan is to kill him. And so Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. Now, why is it that that's all that they were doing? Because that's all they could do. These were a people who had no political power. They had no wealth. They had no influence. They had no army. They had no capacity in their own resources to deliver Peter, whom they love, their leader and pastor. And they prayed. And that's enough. That was enough, you see. God took them to that point that we talked about a little bit earlier, where that's all you can do. And that's sometimes where God takes you, and that's where they're at. But they're so much like us. It's amazing. as you read through the story. It says, so Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. And then it says, on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, so he's going to bring him forward the next day, Peter was sleeping. Now, we've talked about sleep, didn't we? We said that sleep is a metaphor for what?
Death.
For death. And every person understands that intuitively. When I was a teenager and I was in high school, my mother would come to wake me up in the morning. I wouldn't wake up. She'd come to wake me up in the morning. I wouldn't get up. She'd come to wake me up in the morning, and then she'd put ice cubes in my underwear. I would get up. All right? But I could hear her walking down the hallway saying to my dad, trying to wake that kid is like trying to wake the dead. Now, he's not dead, but you have that category of thought now. You understand that the Bible speaks of sleep and death interchangeably. Death for the Christian is something that we intend to wake up from. It's a rest. It's like sleep. So anyway, Peter is sleeping, and he's between two soldiers. So now he's sleeping, and there's one on his right and there's one on his left during the time of the Passover. And he's chained. He's bound with two chains, and then as we get to verse 8 in a minute, you'll see that he's naked because he has to put his clothes on in verse 8. And guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, it says, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared to him from this pit, from this dungeon that he's been put into, and a light shone into the cell. So the dungeon is dark. And he struck Peter's what? Side. He's struck in the side by an angel. Everywhere else in the Bible, when an angel strikes you, you die. This Herod, of which we're reading, in the next passage of Scripture in the book of Acts, is struck by an angel in Caesarea, and he dies. So think about this for a minute. Here's Peter. He's been put into a pit. He's got one on his right, one on his left. He's sleeping, which is a metaphor for death. He's chained his arms. And so he looks like this. Okay, you ready? And while he's asleep, he's struck in the side. Does that sound familiar? So an angel strikes his side and wakes him up. So he wakes up from his death, if you will, and says, get up quickly. Actually, what the word in the Greek language is he says, arise. Arise, he says. And his chains fell off his hands. That's a glorious thought. See, as you preach through there, you can stop and go, man, there are a lot of chains, like there are a lot of watering holes. There are a lot of chains. And the power of God is the power that can break those chains. We sing about those things, and we read about those things here. And so it says, and the angel said to him, gird yourself and put on your sandals. So he's saying, put your clothes on, man. And he did so. And he said to him, wrap your cloak around you, because he's in the nude. You see, he's naked, hanging there like this when he's struck in the side. Jesus hung on the cross naked. It's part of his humiliation before everyone. Wrap your cloak around you, and he says, and follow me. And so the angel now is going to release him from this pit. And he, Peter, went out and continued, and he did not know what was being done by the angel, or that what was being done by the angel was real, but he thought he was seeing a vision. He thinks he's dreaming, I guess. And when they had passed the first guard, so there's the number 1, and the second guard, there's the number 2, what else does he need to get through to be completely released? There's going to be 3 impediments to his getting out of there safe. So he's got to get past the first guard. If you're counting, that's 1. He goes past the second guard. Okay, yeah, that's 2. And then they came to the iron gate. That's number 3. There's always a 3. that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. It's amazing. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed. And Peter has been delivered. And now, having been delivered, what does he go to do? He goes to announce his deliverance to his people. Verse 11, when Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary. So there's a Mary involved in this then. The mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice, how does she recognize Peter? By his voice, right? It's by his voice. Because of her joy, she didn't open the gate, but she ran to tell the disciples. So you have a woman who encounters Peter. He's been released and delivered by an angel from this. He's come through 3 impediments, 3 things standing between him and freedom. He goes to announce to his disciples or to other believers that he's free. He encounters a woman who's distressed over his well-being, recognizes him by his voice, and she runs to tell the others. It's a familiar story. Because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran to tell the disciples, and ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. And what do they think of her? They think she's nuts. Oh, come on. That's crazy. I mean, he might as well be raised from the dead. It's very familiar. The pattern is there. Here they are praying fervently for his release. He's released, and they don't believe it, and that's a real challenge for us, isn't it? And we do that all the time, or at least I do. It's like when the Lord answers your prayer, you're shocked. And sometimes we don't even notice. We figure it out 3 months later. You know what? I think I actually prayed for that. But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door, they saw him and were amazed, and he showed to them his nail-pierced hands. No, that's a different story. Or is it? But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the pit, out of the prison. And he said, "Report these things to James," a different James, by the way, "and the brethren." He's saying, "Go tell my story, the story of my deliverance." And he left and went to another place. And with one other exception, that is the end of the story of Peter in the book of Acts. And there begins really, actually in chapter 9, but the book of Acts becomes dominated with the story of Paul. So what is that a story of? Yeah, it's there. Jesus, right? Who was taken at the time of the Passover, who was arrested, put in bonds, tried before a man named Herod, crucified naked with one on his right and one on his left to please the Jews. It's fitting. It works. He slept the sleep of death, and he looked like this. And while sleeping the sleep of death, he's pierced in the side. He's placed in a dark pit, guarded by the Romans. And after passing through 3 days of death, he arises from the dead. He's freed by the angel. And who then discovers the empty tomb? Mary. She runs to the disciples, and they tell her that she's nuts. Right? And he appears first to this woman, Mary, who recognizes him by his voice. You following this? And yet when they're gathered together, though the door was not open, Jesus appears to them and he shows them his hands. And he says, "Go tell people about me." And he ascends into heaven, and with one or two exceptions, that's the end of the story of Christ's ministry here on earth, except as it takes place through you.
Amen.
It's amazing. It's amazing. There is a pattern to the life of Jesus, and it's a pattern that shows up. It's a pattern of life, it's a pattern of death, it's a pattern of burial, it's a pattern of resurrection, and it's a pattern, and this is important, that ends in glory. Our sufferings end in glory. The sufferings of the Lord end in glory. The difficulties that we endure for the cross end in glory. Our end is eternal glory. Glory upon glory. And you see that with Paul. Paul speaks of all the trials that he goes through, and they're significant.
Amen.
Oh, and he talks of them as light and momentary afflictions. You know, and you read the list of all the stuff he goes through, and you think, I don't know that I would classify any of those things as light or momentary. But he's looking at them through the lens of the glory that they are going to reap eternally. And he's saying, these sufferings are nothing compared to the glory that's coming. I find it pretty cool that it's in the midst of suffering that you see this pattern.
Amen.
That right there in the middle of this trying life or death moment for Peter, it's in that moment that this pattern is most profoundly present. That makes sense? So let that encourage you. You know, in the difficult times, let that encourage you and strengthen you, that God is doing a work in you, and somewhere there's a pattern, I think, in our lives too. All right. Next story involves Paul. And this same kind of idea, this same kind of a pattern, this same sort of a demonstration of the reality of the life, death, burial, resurrection, and then ultimately of the glory of Christ being born out in this guy's life. We see a pattern when our hearts and eyes and minds are trained to look for the pattern and to see it. It's there. It's a little bit of an obscure story. It involves a snake. And yesterday we talked a lot about the serpent, so I'm not going to go all the way back through that part. But you remember that the serpent is the emblem of evil. It's in the form of a talking snake that the evil one enters into paradise and wrecks it. The serpent becomes the emblem of evil in the Bible. It's the fiery serpent that God sent among the Israelites when they complained about the heavenly bread. You'll recall that from yesterday. And so just hang on to that idea as you travel into this story. It's in Acts 27. And what's happening here is Paul is on his way to Rome. He's traveling on a ship. Somewhere in the midst of this journey on the ship, there is a great storm that comes upon the sea. And by the time we get rolling in this story, this storm has been going not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days, not 10 days, 14 days. It's been raging on and on and on. And even the sailors have given up hope. When the sailors give up hope, that's a problem. So everybody has figured out, this is it, we're going to die. They've gone 14 days, it says, without eating. And on the morning of the 14th day, Paul calls together this group of sufferers, this band of brothers who are all hanging in the midst of this storm together. They're all literally in the same boat. And in verse 33, it says, Paul was encouraging them to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching for land, is the idea, and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair, he says, from the head of any of you will perish. And having said this, in this intimate gathering, what does Paul do? He takes bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it. So he's distributing it. He began to eat, and all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. He took it, he blessed it, he broke it, he distributed it. They ate together, and as soon as they have finished eating, one of the sailors spotted land, and they start making for the shoreline, the problem being that between them and the shoreline are all these rocks. And they run the ship aground, and the ship is destroyed, and all these people are scattered across the sea. But they all make it safely ashore. And so in chapter 28, verse 1, it says, when they had been brought safely through, it says, then we, see Luke's there, then we found out that the island was called Malta, and the natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in, and because of the cold, that's important, they kindled a fire and received us all around the fire. So it's cold, and they're gathering around a fire. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks, now what are you doing? When you're carrying a bundle of sticks, what are you carrying? What are sticks made of? Wood. So Paul is carrying wood. Okay? And he laid them on the fire. A viper, the very emblem of evil and death, came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. So his hand is pierced. So when you replay this so far, you've got this band of brothers. They're all sort of in it together. They're facing a massive storm. They're about to be scattered. Paul takes hold of this group. He gathers them together. He encourages them. He blesses the bread, breaks and distributes it, and they eat together before they're then scattered upon the sea. They all make it safely ashore. It's cold, and they gather around a fire. And Paul, who is carrying wood, has his hand pierced by the very emblem of evil and death. And it says, when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, undoubtedly this man is a murderer. Because of what's happened to him, they assume that he's a criminal is the idea. And though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. So the idea is they see what's happened to him. This one who carries wood and whose hand is pierced with the emblem of evil, they assume is a criminal because of what they see. That's going to change. But they're saying justice has not allowed them to live. What justice would they be referring to? Because it's not the justice of a judge. The police didn't show up and pierce his hand. They're saying that this man must have offended the gods. And that even though he escaped from one of their judgments, the storm, the gods would not allow him to escape. They caused him to be pierced with the very emblem of evil and death. Okay? However, it says Paul shook the creature, the emblem of evil and death, off into the fire, and he suffered no harm. So he demonstrates a power over death. These guys know what these snakes are. They know to be bitten by this snake is to die. So he suffers a death wound, and yet he overcomes it. And so the natives who were expecting that Paul was going to swell up, they even give you the symptoms, swell up or suddenly fall down dead, but instead he violates all of their expectations. And it says, but after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual to happen to him, so they're watching to see what's going to happen. They wait a long time. They changed their minds and began to say that he was a god because death has no hold on him. So they changed their opinions completely when he demonstrates a power over death. And it says, now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously for how many days?
3 days.
3 days. It's a little more obscure in this story, I will grant you. But the careful eye can find it. 3 days is big, and on the third day, if you know the story, he performs a great miracle, Paul does. A healing miracle. And having performed that healing miracle, then all the other villagers who have sicknesses and diseases come to him and they're healed. So, there you go. But how does the passion narrative of Christ begin? It begins in an intimate gathering, a gathering together of a group of guys, a band of brothers who are about to experience a major storm like they've never experienced before. The Lord is going to be arrested. The Lord is going to be tried. The Lord is going to be crucified. The Messiah in whom they've placed all their hopes is going to die. And he's going to die. And they're scattered. All of them. And Jesus is arrested, and he's taken to the house of the high priest, and it's a cold night. You remember that? They're gathered around that charcoal fire. You remember? And here comes Peter sort of sneaking along and denying that he knows Christ, and yet wanting to see what happens. And you remember the story? Peter's warming himself by the fire. And he denies Jesus and denies Jesus and denies Jesus, and the cock crows. And what does Jesus do? He looks at him. You wonder about that look. He turns and he looks at him, and Peter leaves and weeps. Jesus is falsely charged, falsely tried, falsely convicted by who? By the religious leaders that Jesus and John the Baptist had both referred to as a brood of vipers, the very emblem of evil and death. And so it's at the behest of these vipers that Jesus carries the wood upon which his hands are pierced up the hill. And because he is crucified between two criminals, what do you think everybody passing by thought he must have been? Must have been a criminal. Criminal. You would assume the guy in the middle?
Criminal.
Yeah. Largely regarded as a criminal. The justice of God would not allow him to live because the penalty for sin is death. We know that in this room. And so he dies. There is a greater justice at play that requires him to die. However, he conquers death on the third day, which is indeed a great miracle. And when he does, he's regarded as a God. Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." So there it is again. Over and over again. It's life, it's death, it's burial, it's resurrection. And it runs through the Scriptures. Okay? All right, does that make sense? Justice. You see that to some degree in Jacob's life. You know, Jacob killed an animal, shed its blood, used its furs to steal the birthright of the blessing of his brother, to deceive his father in his old age. Jacob's sons kill an animal. And they dip Joseph's tunic in its blood. And they bring it to the man who himself had used an animal to deceive. And they deceive him with it. See that? See how that works? We saw an example of that also earlier in Jacob's life. You know, Jacob deceives his father in the darkness of his blindness. Jacob himself is deceived in the darkness of the night. And in both cases, you know, I mean, he's reaping what he's sowing. Or you see? You follow that? You see that run through the Bible. It's called talionic justice. That which you sow, well, that is what you're going to reap. And we need to be careful with that. That justice applies to us. What are we sowing? What are we sowing with our kids? What are we sowing in our marriages? What are we sowing in our relationships? What are we sowing in the hearts and minds of our church? What is the ethic that we're giving to them? That which you sow, that you will also reap. It's interesting, Ron mentioned the seeker-sensitive movement in America. That's absolutely the case, you know, but the theory, I think, behind it was if you build it, they will come. They built the greatest show, in a sense, to attract people, and they would then share the gospel. And these are very well-intended, very, very bright, very talented, very capable people who did this. And I'm not necessarily critical of, certainly not of their heart for reaching people, or of their willingness to use strategy to do it. That's great. I just think to some degree that which you sow, that's what you're going to reap. I mean, what you bring them with is what you keep them with. And as soon as a bigger show opens up downtown, it starts to leave, right? One of those churches did a study about the spiritual growth of their people. And they published it to their great credit because it was highly critical of the methodology of that church for 25 years. It's one of the most famous of the churches that has done the seeker-sensitive movement. And what they found is that they've created a culture at their church where they've taught their people that everything is to be found here in the church. And so people come to the church, and for all of their resources, for all of their stuff, what they have not done is created a people who have learned to feed themselves, who have learned to read and study the Bible for themselves, who have learned to reach and teach and disciple people and multiply themselves. It's very different from the philosophy of EE, right? I mean, it's very much of a discipleship philosophy where you're reproducing yourselves, and then those people reproduce themselves, and it's not a gathering one place, but it's exactly what Ron said. It's a go out there. And at least in America, I'll tell you frankly, build it and they will come is not the case anymore, at least not for unbelievers. Build it and other Christians from other churches will come because you've got a better children's ministry, or you've got a more dynamic speaker, or you have a cooler place, or you've got a supermarket in your church, or you've got a... I'm not kidding about those things, by the way. I mean, like a mall. And I'm not critical of the churches that have all of those things. I'm friends with the pastor of one of the largest churches in America. I love that man and what God has done through that church. I praise all the time. It's great. It's amazing. But build it and unbelievers will come is not occurring. We've got to go back. That's what happens in your office. That's what happens in your school. That's what happens in your neighborhood. That's what happens when you go door to door. And that's the ethic that we need to build in our people. It's a going ethic. We come together as a group of people who go out and face hardship and persecution and all kinds of issues and difficult times. And we gather together as the people of God to love one another, to help meet one another's needs, to help one another, to teach one another for the Word of God, to go back together over and over again to the cross and to the puzzle piece theology of the Lord that says, I know this looks really tough, and right now life stinks, but God's painting a great big picture. And somehow, someday, this is going to be beautiful as it finds its place in the picture. And then, energized and in relationship with each other, we go out. I think that's the way it's supposed to work. The idea behind the message that I unpacked for our people, and now hopefully for you today, at least to some degree, is that people matter to God and they need to matter to us. And when we say people, we mean everybody. All people. Okay? Even people that maybe we don't like. Even people whose lives that, if we start feeling a little too good about ourselves, we're very tempted to judge. One of the inescapable lessons of Scripture is that it is the moral people, it is the religiously observant people, it is the so-called good people, it is the people like us who tend to struggle with this the most. And so Jesus comes to us in Luke chapter 15, and he tells us, not one, not two, but he tells us 3 parables to counter this mentality that somehow the bad people are excluded from the gospel. And if you know, earlier in this chapter, he gives you the story of the lost sheep, and then he gives you the story of the lost coin, and then he brings it all to a head in a climax, and the one that we're going to be looking at, which is the story of the lost son. Okay? But it's not just a story about one son. It's a story about 2, and they're both lost. And I'll tell you plainly, the story is for the older brother. That's who it's for. It's for the religious people. That's who he's talking to. Luke 15, verse 1, it says, now the tax collectors and sinners, the so-called bad people in that culture, were all drawing near to Jesus, which then begs the question of, well, if they're drew near to Jesus and they're not drawing near to me, or they're not drawing near to my church, or they drew near to his, what's wrong? Because if I have the same heart of Jesus, and if I have the same message of Jesus, will I not also attract the same people as Jesus? Sinners come to Jesus. The tax collectors and sinners, the so-called bad people, were all drawing near to Jesus, and the Pharisees and scribes, the moral people, the religiously observant people, the so-called good people, grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." They're fine with this idea that people matter to God and they need to matter to us as long as they can pick and choose who the people are. But when the people that matter to God and need to matter to us start including people like sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes and all the folks who are commonly found around the Christ, who is our Lord, well, they're not so happy. And so Jesus told who this parable? He told them this parable. He's speaking to the religious people. He's speaking to the good people. He said, "What man of you having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until when? Until he gets tired, until he runs out of patience, until he throws up his hands and says, 'That's it, I'm so sick of this sheep running away. That stupid sheep this time, he's gone too far, he's going to get what he deserves, he finally is going to get what he has coming to.'" No, until he finds it. Our shepherd looks for us until he finds us. Period. And when he has found it, he gives it a GPS system, he gives it a map, he says, "Look, if you go down the road, there's a big oak tree about a half a mile, and then you can take a right there, and you go down, there's a big stone, okay, and then you can take a left, and there's a store, and a lady named Beth works there, and when you ask her for directions, she'll..." Look at what he does. When he's found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." And they do rejoice with him. Why do they rejoice with him? Because people matter to God and they need to matter to us, okay? And that means even the bad people. They understand that that lost sheep, that one that went away, is just as valuable as all 99 of the rest of them. And then Jesus peels back the veil of heaven and reveals the Father heart of God. And he says, "Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance," tongue in cheek. And then it's like he looks around at the Pharisees, at all the religious people, maybe at us, as if to say, "Okay, are you getting the message? Is it hitting home? Was that story enough, or do I have to tell you another story?" So then he tells them another story. Verse 8, he says, "Or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and seek diligently until she gets tired or runs out of patience, or the baby starts crying, or time to go pick the kids up at school, or, she just gets sick of looking for the doggone thing and says, 'You know what, my effort is more valuable to me at some point than all of this, than this coin is. My goodness, I could have gone out and got a job and replaced it 6 times with all the time that I've spent looking for it.'" She sweeps the house. She lights the lamp and sweeps the house and seeks diligently until she finds it. And when she has found it, here we go again, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." And they do, because they all understand and agree that what was lost is precious. That just like all the coins that didn't roll away, the coin that did is valuable. People matter to God, they need to matter to us, even the so-called bad people, even the wayward people, even the wandering people, the lost people. Just so, he peels back the veil of heaven and says, "I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents." And again, he looks at their eyes, at my eyes, at your eyes, as if to say, "Okay, did you get it that time? Is 2 stories enough?" It's not enough. So he gives us the third climactic story. It's called the parable of the prodigal son, but it's really the parable of 2 sons. And they both lost. It says, "And Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons." There it is. "And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me.' He's saying, look, I want you to give me my inheritance now, which is a very unusual request because you get an inheritance, generally speaking, after somebody dies. But he doesn't want to wait until somebody dies here. He's saying to his dad, look, I'm not interested in you. I'm not interested in serving you. I'm not interested in loving you. I'm not interested in relationship with you. I'm not interested in you at all. Let me tell you what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what you can give me, what you can do for me, and how you can make my life work the way I want it to do. And since I'm too, impatient to wait for you to die, Dad, just give me the money now, because that's really all I want from you. And if you think that would be offensive today, back then, unbelievably offensive. Jesus says there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property. It means literally, give me the life that is coming to me. And instead of disinheriting him entirely, he gives it to him. The father divided his property between them, and then, not too many days later, because his bags were already packed and his travel arrangements were already made, the son gathered all that he had, and he took a journey into a far country, a place that his heart had clearly been residing for a long, long time before he left the house. And that, too, is instructive. Your heart leaves for the far country before the rest of you do. Be careful where you go in your heart, because the rest of you follows. Very significant. Not many days later, because his heart's already checked into the hotel, the son gathered all that he had, and he took a journey into a far country looking for what? Looking for what in the end he discovers can only be found in the embrace of his father. He's looking for something that he has all along in his dad. He just doesn't realize it. And so he squanders all of his property in reckless living, okay? The party is on. The problem with a party, and I've been to a lot of them. I was in a fraternity. I was at a fraternity house. Is that a party at some point ends. And when it's over, it leaves a big mess and a big headache. He goes to the far country. He squanders it all. The party is on. And when he had spent everything, and the party ended, and all of the people that he thought were his friends now left because he's not buying the drinks anymore, a severe famine arose in that country. The far country is a place of death. It is a place of deprivation. There's no life where there's no water. And he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the Gentile citizens of the country. And you know that he's a Gentile because he has pigs. No Jew would have pigs. And the Gentile servant or resident of that country, I think, took great delight in sending this Jewish boy out to work with the pigs. I think there was a certain satisfaction in that. He sent the boy into the fields to feed the pigs, and just when you think that it couldn't get any worse for this guy, it says, and he, this lost son, was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. So he's starving, and he's so hungry that he wants to eat pig food. Okay? That's as low as you go in the culture of Christ. And he's looking at his life, and he's thinking to himself, good grief, this was not in the brochure for the far country. When I went online and I took the virtual tour, I did not see this in any of the photographs. None of the testimonials that I listened to before I decided to go to the far country mentioned anything about pig food. And that too is the way that sin works. It promises life, it delivers death. It promises satisfaction, and it gives you dissatisfaction. It says, wow, look at me, I'm a lot of fun, and it leaves you with a mess and a hangover and a headache and bankruptcy. And God comes to you in His Word, and we resent His Word. Oh, the Lord is too restrictive. The Lord's not trying to enslave you. The Lord's trying to free you. Freedom is found within boundaries. That's why we have traffic signals in our roads. They're designed to help us get where we need to go, as opposed to having absolute gridlock. Jesus says that he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him any food. And here it comes. It says, but when he came to himself, he woke up. And he saw his life for what it really was, and his Father for who he really is. He said, how many of my Father's servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? So he's realized that his Father is the source of life. He says, I will rise and go home. That's not what he says. It's very significant. Every word matters. He says, I will arise and go to my Father. The Father is the destination. The Father is the source of life. The Father is who he's looking for. And I will repent and say to him, and it's so cool because he plans his little speech. It's like he writes it on a 3x5 card. And then practices it all the way home. I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. So he's figured out exactly what he's going to say when he sees Dad. And he arose and he came to his father, and then quite dramatically, and you've got to feel the drama of the story. The story is the vehicle. Get them on the bus and let them feel it. The camera lens shifts to the dad. And where is the dad? In those days, the houses would use their roofs like patios. They didn't have air conditioning, you know. It was a very hot and arid country, and they would build staircases up the sides of the homes. You see that in the story of the paralytic. His 4 friends come and they bring him, they can't get him in the door, so they go up onto the roof. Well, they just walk up the staircase. And they dug through about a foot of mud and then some, tangled branches, and then they dug their way through the roof and lowered him. I think the dad is on the roof. The vantage point. The best place for him to look down the road. And clearly he is looking in the direction of the far country, hoping and praying for the return of his son. Work this through when you preach and teach it. Sit in it. Play the story out. The father is up on the roof and he's looking longingly in the direction that his son left to head off in. And imagine it with your people. So he's looking that direction and he sees on the horizon a tiny little speck. He's seen thousands of specks since his son left. But as he's looking at the speck, it seems like maybe there's something familiar about it. Maybe it's the way this little speck that's getting a little bit larger as it comes this direction holds its head. Maybe it's the way he swings his arms. Maybe it's the way he walks his walk. You know a person's walk. You know your children's walk, don't you? And as he studies this speck, he realizes, wow, it looks kind of familiar. The heart of the father starts pounding. As the speck gets a little closer, he's saying, okay, hey, you know what? There's a real possibility here. And the heart of the father starts pounding. And as he gets a little bit closer, he's going, good grief, I'm pretty sure that that's him. And the heart of the father starts racing. The adrenaline starts pumping. And as soon as he gets a little closer, he's full on sure that it's him. Dad comes off the roof. And he comes ripping down the staircase. He rips it halfway off the wall. As he's coming down, he's coming so fast. He sprints through the flowers, the garden. He clears the hedge and the white picket fence by 1.5 feet, lands out in the street, rolls in the dirt, gets up, and starts racing at his boy, who's got this 3x5 card in his hand with his speech all prepared, thinking, oh, is he coming to kill me or is he coming to kiss me? What is he going to do when he gets here? Because he knows what he deserves. He knows what he deserves. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. And ran embraced him and kissed him. I kind of envision him running as fast as he can and not even slowing down and just taking him down the narrow road. And as he's coming, the son's going, Dad, I don't even deserve to be your son. Stop, just hang on a second. And bam! Tears streaming. Loving his son. Hugging his son. Rolling around, shouting in joy for the return of this son that he's waited so long for. It's marvelous. Finally, his son gets out his 3x5 card and says, No, I got a speech for you. Father, I sinned against heaven. No, son, you're home. No, Dad, really, I got to get this all the way out. I've sinned against heaven and before you. Believe you me, I'm aware of that. Nice to hear it. Love that you're here. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. No, you're right about that, but you're still my son. And the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe. What does the best robe do? The best robe covers over his filth and crud and stink, his tattered and awful clothing. It's the robe of the righteousness of the Lord. Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring, the emblem of sonship, on his hand and authority. And shoes, for to go shoeless in that culture was a sign of extreme poverty. Put shoes on his feet and bring the fattened calf. You know that one that we've been saving just for this day? And kill it and let us eat and celebrate. Why? For this my son was dead and is alive. It's resurrection. He was lost and is found. They strike up the band and they, call in the neighbors, and it is a party going on, but it's not just a story about one son. In fact, it's not even primarily about that son. It's about the other guy. And every one of us is or were one of the other of these guys. Verse 25, now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. What's going on? And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And the servant said to him, excitedly, I'm sure, because the father's excited, your brother has come home, and your father's killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound. And the older brother said, praise Jesus, this is exactly what I've been praying for ever since he left. I went and tried to find him over and over, wasn't able to hunt him down. Nothing's been right since he left. Every night at dinner, I look and there's his empty chair, and it just feels wrong. Every celebration we have, every Christmas and Easter and birthday party, every time his birthday would go by, my gut just wrenched as I missed my brother. Hallelujah. Now instead, he was angry. So angry he wouldn't even go in. But note this. His father came out to him too. Comes out for him too. And he entreats and he pleads with him to join the feast, to eat at the table. But he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Look how good I've been, is what he's saying. Look what I've done for you. And yet, you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. Which means what? That all along that he's been serving his father, he's not serving his father because he loves his father. He's not serving his father because he cares for his father. He's not serving his father out of sheer delight for his dad. He's not interested in his dad at all. He's been serving his father all along, hoping that by his service for his father will finally give him what he really wants from his dad, which is money and wealth and heaven, if you want to put it that way, and all of the things that belong to his father. He's exactly like the other lost son. He just has a different method for trying to get what he wants from dad. His heart's no closer to the father. In fact, in the end, it's farther away. What a hypocrite. Instead of openly offending his father to get his wealth, he dutifully slaves away, thinking that because of his obedience, he'd be able to say, look at my good life. Now give me what I really need from you. He was angry and refused to go in. His father came out to him too and entreated him to come and eat from the table. But he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you and I have never disobeyed your command. Look at how good I've been, and yet you never gave me a young goat even so much that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, do you hear that? This son of yours, not my brother. Don't you dare compare him with me. When this son of yours, when this tax collector and sinner came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed a fat calf for him. You gave to him what only I am good enough to deserve, is what he's saying. And his father said to him, son, you're always with me, and all that's mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother, don't miss it, because that's who he is. He's your brother, was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found, and that's the end of the story. And you say, well, okay, so what happened with the older brother then? I mean, did he get the message? Did he go in? Did he not? I don't know, but as I note here in the notes, I know that the father in the parable is God. I know that the prodigal son is the tax collectors and the sinners, and every one of us here today who has rebelled and run away from God and come back. And I know that the older brother is the Pharisee or the scribe, or any one of us here today who are trying to earn God's favor by being good people. As you guys need to know, no such things. There are no good but one. And that's Jesus. So when you come to a story like that, don't let somebody else read it for you and then get up and go, and then you noticed about the prodigal son. Let that story bring you to tears. Let that story move your soul. And use that story as it's designed to be used, to move the hearts and minds and stir the souls of your people, to take hold of them in a way that it never has before, to bring them to the Lord. Okay?